The passage of time is a relentless editor, a force that systematically smooths the edges of trauma and turns once shocking events into historical footnotes, shrouded in the cold, inevitable dust of archive rooms. Its primary weapon is oblivion. It fades the ink on brittle documents and quiets the frantic whispers of witnesses until silence becomes the established narrative. Yet, occasionally, time falters in its duty. The grave markers it places over unresolved tragedies prove insufficient, and the past, heavy and immutable, leverages some unforeseen event to shatter the present moment. These are the moments when evidence, long suspended between memory and disbelief, crashes violently back into the world of the living. This investigation chronicles 5 such distinct cold cases, each defined by an improbable reappearance decades after the initial silence fell, jarring our modern understanding of permanence and loss. Our journey begins with the enigma of the vanishing vessel, a mystery defined by the vast, unforgiving indifference of the ocean. In the late 1980s, the Kestrel, a rugged, sea-battered fishing trawler operating out of the port of Anchorage, vanished during a routine late-season haul in the Gulf of Alaska. The search operation was massive, encompassing Coast Guard patrols and civilian aircraft, scouring thousands of square miles of frigid, churning water. The official consensus, after weeks of fruitless effort, was agonizingly familiar. Structural failure, a sudden rogue wave, or swift icing had dragged the boat and its 3-person crew to the abyssal floor, never to be seen again. They were declared lost at sea, and the Kestrel transitioned from a working vessel to a ghost ship, a tragic legend whispered among the maritime community. 30 years passed. The technological landscape shifted. The children of the lost crew members had aged into middle life. Then, in the summer of 2018, a surveillance aircraft monitoring remote tidal activity near the Aleutian Chain reported an anomaly. A large, dark object had drifted into a sheltered cove on an uninhabited stretch of Alaskan shoreline, grinding slowly against the basalt rock. When the retrieval team finally reached the location, a place accessible only by helicopter and defined by relentless, corrosive salt spray, they found the Kestrel. It was undeniable. The hull was heavily scarred, the paint stripped back to bleached raw wood in caustic streaks. The wheelhouse glass was fractured, webbed with 30 years of deep microcracks, giving the interior a sepulchral dimness. The deck was a thriving, alien landscape of marine life. Thick layers of bleached barnacles coated every surface, interspersed with dark, dense patches of tenacious green moss and small, mineralized skeletal remains of gulls. The scene was one of profound, suspended decay. The scent inside the lower cabins was overpowering, a heavy, metallic combination of stale saltwater, diesel fuel oxidized over decades, and the cold, damp musk of preserved mold. The engine room was a ruin of rusted iron and seized components. However, the true shock lay tucked inside the navigational cabinet in the primary pilot house. Protected by the slight shelter of the structure, resting beneath a heavy sheaf of sodden, compressed nautical charts, was the ship's logbook. Though waterlogged and swollen, the paper, preserved by some accidental chemical interaction with the oil-based ink and the extreme cold, retained its integrity. The binding had disintegrated, but the pages were readable. The initial entries detailed routine fishing activity, mundane observations on weather patterns, and fuel consumption. Then came the final terrifying sequence of entries, scrawled in an increasingly erratic hand. The date matched the day the Kestrel was presumed lost. The log documented not a structural failure, but a catastrophic, unexplained mechanical system collapse followed by an immediate, inexplicable loss of power, leaving the vessel adrift and subject to a fierce, rapidly developing squall. The final entry, smeared and almost illegible, conveyed a frantic sense of disorientation. A reference to a colossal, unnatural shadow on the radar screen that defied interpretation, followed by a sudden, jarring impact that seized the recording instrument. The entry ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing off into a jagged black slash. The ship had not sunk, but had been incapacitated and then carried, a lifeless, sealed coffin, by the great gyres of the North Pacific for 3 decades, only to surrender its chilling, inconclusive testimony on a desolate, cold beach far from any witness. The reappearance solved the question of the sinking, but introduced a new, far more profound maritime mystery concerning the circumstances of its death. The narrative pivots now from the vastness of the sea to the cold confinement of Earth, specifically to the puzzle of the stolen royal artifacts. This mystery began nearly 2 centuries ago in the heart of Central Europe, involving a collection known as the Coronation Jewels of the House of Valerius. These weren't merely decorative pieces, they were symbols of national sovereignty, crafted from rare earth minerals, studded with immense, deep-cut gemstones, and historically priceless. They vanished overnight from the heavily guarded royal treasury during a period of intense political upheaval in the 1830s. The theft was immediate and total. Contemporary investigators suspected internal treachery, perhaps a coordinated effort by revolutionaries aiming to liquidate national assets, or, conversely, a desperate act by loyalists seeking to prevent their capture.
The subsequent century saw periodic, tantalizing hints, a jewel here, a sketch there, but the bulk of the collection was deemed irretrievably lost.
The prevailing historical theory settled on the most pragmatic and depressing outcome. The artifacts had been quickly dismantled, melted down for their base gold and platinum, and the gemstones scattered across the black markets of the continent, rendering them permanently anonymous. The Valerius treasure became a legend, a painful gap in the National Museum's exhibition space, represented only by faded daguerreotypes. The reappearance came not through a forensic investigation, but through a matter of municipal infrastructure. In the autumn of 2007, during a routine engineering survey for a new underground transit line in a quiet, historically protected district of an old European capital, geological scanners registered an unusual subterranean void beneath the foundation of an otherwise unremarkable late Baroque mansion. The mansion, known locally as the Black House, due to its darkened stone facade, had been owned by a succession of reclusive families and had stood largely empty for the last 50 years, its gardens overgrown, its windows opaque with grime. Intrigue led to a measured excavation. Beneath the mansion's ancient, twisting wine cellars, shielded by a seemingly solid wall of stacked granite that was, in fact, a cleverly concealed rotating stone partition, engineers discovered a sealed chamber. The air within the chamber, once breached, was thick and immediate. The heavy, sweet smell of forgotten history mixed with the acrid scent of mold and dry earth. The space was small, roughly 10 feet by 15 feet, meticulously constructed and clearly designed for permanence. The humidity had done its best to claw at the contents, but the depth and the hermetic nature of the seal had provided a profound degree of preservation. Under the beam of high-powered spotlights, the discovery stunned the archival team. Resting on a series of heavily timbered raised platforms, preventing direct contact with the damp stone floor, was the Valerius collection, seemingly whole. The artifacts had not been melted down, they had been cached. The gold exhibited only a thin layer of oxidation, lending it a muted, matte appearance rather than its original blinding luster. The gold exhibited only a thin layer of oxidation, lending it a muted, matte appearance rather than its original blinding luster. Jewel settings, though slightly dimmed by ambient dust, still held the intense, cold fire of the rubies and sapphires. There were diadems wrapped in century-old stiffened silk that instantly crumbled upon contact, scepters cradled in original, now verdigris-stained velvet linings, and a great heavy coronation collar whose complex filigree was perfectly intact. The chamber itself offered clues to the custodian, not the thief. Resting beside the cache was a small lead-lined box containing meticulously maintained documents, journals dated in the 1830s and 1840s, written by a high-ranking court official who, fearing the jewels would fall into the hands of a hostile revolutionary government, had undertaken their complex concealment. He had not been the thief, but the desperate preserver. He had died, as the records showed, unexpectedly, just a few years after sealing the vault, taking the location of the hidden trove with him to his grave. For 17 years, the weight of the Valerius history had simply waited, perfectly suspended in subterranean darkness, until the disruptive force of modern infrastructure forced the stone to yield its truth. The atmosphere shifts again, transitioning from the cool, archival stillness of a European basement to the unforgiving, towering silence of the North American high country. This is the domain of the missing hiker, a case defined by the raw brutality of the Sierra Nevada wilderness. In the summer of 1999, Elias Thorne, an experienced but solitary long-distance hiker, set off on a planned 3-week trek through a famously remote section of the range. He never emerged. The search that followed was exhaustive and emotionally draining, covering hundreds of square miles of dense forest floor, treacherous granite scree slopes, and dizzying high-altitude meadows. Search and rescue teams faced overwhelming challenges. The terrain was dendritic, characterized by abrupt shifts in elevation, sudden impenetrable thickets of mountain pine, and unexpected weather events. Though his planned route was known, the vastness of the wilderness allowed for infinite possibilities of deviation. After 6 months of intermittent searching and the onset of winter snows that buried the landscape under yards of insulating white, the search was called off. The consensus among the experts was clear. Thorne had likely succumbed to exposure, injury, or a fall into an unseen crevasse, his body quickly claimed by the relentless processes of nature and obscured by the annual cycle of snowpack and rock movement. His family was left in a limbo of perpetual, agonizing uncertainty, holding on to the faint, irrational hope that he had perhaps chosen to disappear into a new life. A decade later, nature itself provided the resolution. The winter of 2009 was marked by historic levels of precipitation, followed by a rapid, unprecedented melt in early spring. This confluence of water saturation triggered a massive, deep-seated mudslide that scoured a miles-long scar across the mountainside. Thousands of tons of dense earth, ancient soil, boulders, and uprooted trees were stripped away, shifting the entire profile of the landscape. When the slide finally settled, leaving behind a freshly exposed, raw embankment of mineralized soil and churned debris, a small, triangular patch of color emerged near the base of a miraculously spared cluster of silent, towering pines. It was a fragment of bright blue nylon, the material of a tent. Forensic teams, navigating the slick, unstable agglomeration of mud and rock, reached the site. What they found was a decade-old campsite, preserved under an unlikely blanket of earth. It was a small, private tragedy revealed. Thorne had clearly been making camp for the night. The blue tent, flattened and partially ripped by the slide, still contained a moldering sleeping bag. Nearby, a corrosion-resistant aluminum cooking pot and a rusted trowel lay half-buried. Most crucially, nestled amongst the roots of the displaced pines were the skeletal remains of Elias Thorne. The forensic evidence suggested a scenario that required no spectacular twist. He had died where he camped. The remains showed no evidence of violent trauma, The likely cause of death was exposure or a sudden, non-visible medical event, perhaps exacerbated by the cold mountain air. What was extraordinary was not the death, but the burial. An intense, localized debris flow, smaller than the catastrophic 2009 event, but violent enough, must have occurred shortly after his death in 1999, overwhelming his small campsite and entombing it completely under several feet of packed earth and organic debris. For 10 years, he had rested undisturbed, suspended in a shallow, silent grave created by nature's first act, only to be violently exhumed by its second. For the waiting family, the discovery brought a finality that was cold and brutal, yet infinitely preferable to the lingering shadow of the unknown. The pines stood sentinel over the rearranged ground, silent witnesses to the mountain's patient geologic timetable.
Our focus now shifts dramatically, away from the tangible debris of the physical world and into the invisible electromagnetic spectrum, to a mystery defined by pure recurrence.
This is the case of the cryptic radio signals, an auditory anomaly that plagued atmospheric scientists during the nascent stages of deep space monitoring. In the mid-1970s, at a specialized facility nestled in the dry plains of the American Midwest, researchers conducting pioneering surveys of the ionosphere began detecting an extremely precise, non-natural sequence of radio emissions. The signals were fleeting, appearing only for brief intervals, often less than an hour, before vanishing into the static. Their distinguishing feature was their pattern, a complex, mathematically precise cadence of pulses and pauses, exhibiting a repetition rate that defied known terrestrial or natural celestial phenomena. They were too structured to be noise and too intermittent to be a stable stellar source. The signals were categorized internally as the 70s echo, a technical enigma that consumed considerable resources. Teams attempted to correlate the events with solar flares, military transmissions, and even satellite movements. The data was meticulous, recorded on magnetic tape, analyzed by early computer systems, and categorized as inexplicable. The consensus eventually settled on a highly localized, short-lived atmospheric disturbance interacting with newly deployed ground-based antennae, an equipment ghost, a technical error that mimicked structure. By 1979, the signal ceased as abruptly as they had begun. The data tapes were boxed, labeled, and stored in the deep, low-humidity storage vault, relegated to the dusty history of atmospheric science experimentation. For 40 years, the 70s echo remained a footnote. Scientific observation techniques dramatically improved. Analog systems were replaced by hypersensitive digital arrays capable of processing terabytes of data per second. The old tapes were digitized primarily for historical context. Their complex patterns admired more for their historical oddity than their scientific relevance. Then, in late 2019, the silence was shattered. The setting was the Atacama Desert in Chile, a remote location chosen for its extreme altitude, dry air, and unparalleled clarity, the home of the world's most advanced radio astronomy facility. A PhD candidate, operating a new generation of antennae designed for detecting weak, deep space gravitational ripple effects, noticed a disturbing anomaly in the real-time data flow. The system flagged an extremely low-power, high-frequency emission that exhibited an immediate, specific mathematical signature. The cadence was instantly recognizable to anyone who knew the archived history of the field. It was the exact pattern of the 70s echo. The immediate response was one of disbelief, followed by frantic verification. Was this residual noise from old equipment? A sophisticated hoax? The data proved otherwise. The signal was clean, crisp, and demonstrably originating from a fixed point outside the solar system. Furthermore, it was captured simultaneously by 3 separate geometrically spaced hypersensitive arrays, confirming its astronomical reality. The signal repeated the exact sequence of pulses and pauses documented 4 decades earlier, echoing across the silent vacuum of space with renewed urgency. The analysis led to an astonishing realization. The original 1970 signals had not been terrestrial noise or equipment error. They were genuine astrophysical emissions that had, 40 years ago, simply passed through the window of human observation at a frequency barely within the sensitivity range of the rudimentary antennae of the time. The source, highly directional, or perhaps highly intermittent, had resumed transmission decades later, only to be captured by the exponentially more advanced technology waiting in the Chilean high desert. The reappearance of the signal reframed the entire context of the original detection. What was once considered technical static was revealed to be a patient, repeating cosmic geometry, demonstrating that sometimes the evidence is present, but the technology required to perceive it simply hasn't been invented yet. The universe had waited for humanity to upgrade its sensory apparatus. Finally, we arrive at a mystery steeped in the quiet texture of literature and intimate betrayal. The case of the famed author's final, unsent letters. The author, known primarily by their widely recognized nom de plume, was a towering figure of early 20th century literature, known for works characterized by intense, complex emotional ambiguity and a famously reclusive personal life. Their sudden death in 1947 was a shock to the literary world, leaving behind a legacy sealed by the apparent destruction of all personal papers, as mandated in their will. The literary executor confirmed that all correspondence, drafts, and journals were incinerated shortly after the funeral. This act was deeply mourned by scholars, as it created an impenetrable barrier to understanding the author's final years and the specific inspirations behind their most profound work, a novel that had baffled critics for decades with its ambiguous ending. The executor's testimony was accepted. The archive was lost to the flames, leaving only the published texts as evidence of the writer's genius. 70 years of archival silence followed. The material was considered definitively destroyed. Yet, the material had not been burned. It had merely been concealed with the meticulous precision often characteristic of those who live intensely private lives. The reappearance occurred not in a vault or a muddy mountainside, but in the mundane setting of a regional estate auction in the spring of 2017. The item in question was an unassuming antique writing desk, a sturdy piece of mahogany furniture, scarred by decades of domestic use, which had been passed down through 3 generations of a family distantly connected to the author's former staff. The desk was auctioned primarily for its antique value, fetching a modest price. The purchaser, a collector of antique furniture rather than literary history, began the painstaking process of restoration. The desk's drawers were stiff, requiring careful cleaning and alignment. During the restoration of the primary writing surface drawer, the restorer, running their hand along the underside of the heavy wood, noticed a subtle discontinuity, a slight gap where the grain of the wood should have been continuous. Using fine tools, the restorer located a hidden mechanism, a tiny, almost invisible brass latch activated by pushing a specific point in the wood trim. With a faint, protesting creak of aged wood, a false bottom drawer, shallow and long, dropped open. The air that escaped was dry and faint, carrying the smell of old wood sealant and archival silence. Inside, protected from light and air for 7 decades, was a stack of paper. The paper was thick, slightly yellowed, and crisp, like parchment. The ink was a deep black script, instantly identifiable as the author's distinctive, elegant hand. It was the final, unsent correspondence. The cache consisted of 23 letters, meticulously dated to the final 2 years of the author's life, addressed to an unknown confidant. They had been hidden, presumably, moments before the author's death, spared the general incineration by the sheer ingenuity of their hiding place. These letters were a reframing epiphany for the literary world. They detailed not a philosophical ambiguity, but a precise hidden truth concerning the author's final, monumental novel.
The letters revealed that the ending, long debated as either a statement on existential futility or a plea for reconciliation, was in fact a deeply personal coded message intended solely for the recipient of the correspondence, a cryptic farewell that confirmed a relationship and a life context previously unknown to biographers.
The hidden truth, preserved perfectly beneath the veneer of an antique desk, irrevocably altered the understanding of the author's life's work, proving that the most profound secrets can often be hidden in plain sight, requiring only the turn of a handle or the quiet click of a forgotten latch to be revealed.
These 5 episodes, the salt-battered trawler, the cold, shining cache of jewels, the silent remains beneath the shifting earth, the mathematically pure echo in the cosmos, and the brittle, ink-filled pages of a hidden letter, all underscore a chilling reality.
They demonstrate that time does not guarantee oblivion.
Time is merely a suspension agent, holding evidence in stasis until the precise, necessary catalyst arrives. A tide, a surveyor's laser, a torrent of mud, an upgraded antenna array, or the quiet work of a restorer.
Some truths merely wait patiently, suspended between memory and evidence, until the perfect, unexpected moment allows the past to crash violently into the present, demanding immediate and absolute recognition. The universe, it seems, has an endless supply of patience, ensuring that what is lost is only temporarily misplaced.